Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer. Apologies today, there are a little bit of connection issues on our side, so hopefully that doesn't make too much of a difference to your listening experience. But I'm joined today by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you doing, sir?
I'm ready to provide the listening experience to which you have just responded. You have just alluded.
Excellent. And also Mr. Michael Morris. Michael, how are you?
I certainly hope I match that standard, but I'm very well. Beautifully sunny Cape, a bit chilly actually, but beautifully sunny, and all set to engage with you too, Nicholas, in a great conversation.
Indeed, much the same up here in Gauteng. But let us get into the news of today. So we didn't have a show on Friday, so we were not around to talk about the announcement of the Government of National Unity, which is apparently the idea the ANC has put forward as announced by President Ramaphosa on the table to sort of start off the negotiations from the ANC side over what kind of coalition government we're going to look like. So it looks like the confidence and supply agreement, which we suggested might be a possibility, doesn't look like it's going to be going anywhere. Things may change as we get closer to the finalization, but so far that seems to be off the table. So what is a government of national unity? Well, it seems pretty much to kind of be everyone inside the tent so we don't have to make any hard choices kind of choice. And that is essentially, Ramaphosa said that the ANC was going to invite the DA, the IFP, the Patriotic Alliance, the EFF, the DA, the IFP, the Patriotic Alliance, and possibly even MK, as well as basically any other major party into this coalition agreement, which is a bit unwieldy to say the least. Immediately, the EFF seems to have rejected this. Julius Malema described this as arrogant and said that the EFF will not form part of any government that includes the Freedom Front Plus or the DA. The IFP and the DA seem to be much warmer towards it and have continued negotiations with the ANC. As for the MK party, no one really seems to know. Apparently, the ANC did meet with some MK party representatives, but the party has also given very conflicting messages on whether it's interested in any sort of deal. Furthermore, the DA and the IFP, I think, have both said they won't be in a coalition agreement with the MK party. So if MK's in, they're out. They've also, the DA has said that they're not going to be in any coalition agreement with the EFF. So if the EFF is in, the DA is out. So it sort of looks a little bit right now like we're heading towards a ANC-IFP-DA coalition. That seems to be what's having the most negotiating around at the moment. However, it's a little bit unclear exactly what's going to come at the end of this, as originally the ANC actually proposed this idea of a DA-IFP-ANC coalition at a national level, and this was shot down by internal ANC divisions. Apparently, the provincial leaders of all the provinces where the ANC has a majority said that they would not work with just the DA and the IFP. Hence the idea to have this government of national unity. But with MK and the EFF seeming to opt out at the moment, it doesn't really seem like that's going to happen. So maybe we're just going to get, like I said, a DA-IFP coalition anyway. So what do we know about who's proposing what? Well, the DA says they have created a framework which has 6 points as the foundation for a coalition. They include, number 1, protecting the Constitution. Number 2, the independence of the South African Reserve Bank. Number 4, creating an independent, effective, and corruption-free civil service. Number 5, declaring cadre deployment illegal. Reducing national debt to 67% of GDP by 2031, and devolving the management of police forces and passenger trains to local government level. Evidently, the DA is angling for that path, specifically in the Western Cape. So the DA's position also has not asked for any positions in cabinet or parliament. They say they only want effective parliamentary oversight of government, input to budget, and the establishment of a mechanism to resolve disputes within any coalition. The IFP says that it was not opposed in principle to a government of national unity. And together, if the IFP, DA, and ANC are all on board with this, they will have about just under 66% of the seats in Parliament, which would be a pretty solid majority. Apparently, the leader of the faction in the ANC who wanted to negotiate with the DA was Enoch Godongwana, the current finance minister, although he hasn't not been successful. And there's continued to be a lot of division within the ANC about whether they can accept working with the DA. There's lots of pushback against it. There's also some pushback within the DA about whether they should go into a full coalition agreement with the ANC. So things are still very uncertain, but I think we have a basic outline of the pattern there of what the various groups are angling for. So far, we've heard talk that the DA-ANC coalition meetings so far have been quote-unquote positive, is the way that the reporting from News 24 described it. News 24 is also reporting that there has been a proposal to create a neutral finance minister. The president is allowed to select 2 people who are not in parliament to be members of cabinet. And in this case, the idea is that rather than having an ANC or a DA finance minister, the finance ministry would be given to a prominent businessman. The person who's been touted as possibly being this candidate is the CEO of Standard Bank. We don't know exactly whether that's going to fly. So the last thing to mention is that the ANC, excuse me, is we're demanding apparently that this agreement be binding for 5 years. They don't want anyone going out once they've agreed to go in, which I don't think is something the DA would be super happy for, considering how many of their supporters are probably going to be very uncomfortable with this whole agreement. I think the DA and probably the IFP too would want to be able to exit at any time. This would also place potentially KZN as a possible place where you could see an alliance between the DA and ANC to form a new government, locking MK Party out. But yeah, it's all still up in the air. So, Terence, let me start with you. I've just divulged an awful lot of stuff here, but how do you think this stuff is shaping out? There still seems to be a lot of unresolved details. We still haven't seen whether the DA and ANC as a whole will actually back these various agreements. There's even some talk in some of the reporting on this that the ANC wants as many people in the coalition because they're scared that some of their own MPs will vote for the MK Party candidate when it comes time to elect the president. What do you make of all this, Terence?
Well, I was going to say thank you for that concise summary, and I would not be employing any sarcasm because I think that's about as concise as it gets. These things seem to change by the minute. I think my macro point is that this is a situation in which there is no upside for either the ANC or the DA. No matter what they do, they're kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't. And maybe this is the moment that we reach that point of mutually hurting stalemate. For the DA, they can't, they in a sense can't turn some sort of arrangement down because there are enough people in the ANC who would be happy and would be sort of be happy to go in with the EFF side of things. I think there's also if that happened, they would be sort of held to account by many of their own supporters, and I think some of their business backers who would say, well, you had the opportunity to prevent the deluge and you didn't. So whichever way you take it, there's going to be a reputational knock. For the ANC, this for them to go with the DA means in some way to repudiate their revolutionary tradition, and that's not only about the way they present themselves, but the way they think about themselves. They had to go effectively cap in hand to white monopoly capital, and white monopoly capital was not a Bell Pottinger invention. It comes from the SACP in the 1960s. And I was actually on a TV panel discussion, and a guy from the ANC stable kept on referring to white monopoly capital, which they said, well, this is one of the two expressions of capitalism. There's parasitic capitalism like the Guptas and white monopoly capitalism like the Oppenheimers. business as a whole was clearly not seen very, very positively there. My real concern, though, is that the whole arrangement seems to be we can't decide which way to go, so let's try and split the difference and kick a decision down the road. Let others make it for us. So they'll be, entering this, I think, kicking and screaming at some level. And I don't know if the sense of commonality is sufficient to carry it through. I mean, this is something that we've seen from business commentators. It's time to put petty politics aside, do what's best for the country. The problem is they have very different views on that. Even the nature of the problem. So when the DA says, well, it's cadre deployment, we can all agree that the civil service doesn't work, but is it cadre deployment, or is it we're not paying these people enough, or we don't have enough revolutionary zeal, or we must apply more aggressive affirmative action, or we must pay more, or we must throw a whole bunch more training? I mean, these are all questions. So the fact that we can all see a crisis does, no guarantee we're all going to see that crisis in the same way, let alone be able to come up with solutions, let alone solutions from different quarters with which we can all agree. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, having given you my eminently succinct response.
So it really seems now like the ANC is sitting on this kind of crossroads, and it's just refusing to make a decision. The ANC, as far as I can see it, can stay committed to the National Democratic Revolution. That is this policy that includes things like the aggressive BEE platform, like the idea that the ANC is the only true, authentic voice of South Africans and is at the center of society, like cadre deployment, all of these, the kind of state-centric, very sort of old-fashioned communist stuff. The National Democratic Revolution is a product very much of the 60s. It's very much a product of the South African Communist Party. And you can see those groups within the ANC very opposed to any negotiation with the DA. COSATU and the SACP have already said the ANC would be selling out if it negotiates with the DA, and even the IFP to some degree. So that's one direction the ANC can go, is it can stay with the National Democratic Revolution, in which case it doesn't matter what agreement is signed now with the DA. It will fall apart, without a doubt. Either it will just not work and the DA will limp into the next election and kind of fall apart, or and probably the ANC will also then be cannibalized by the EFF and MK, or the DA will leave the coalition at some point, realizing that the ANC has not changed the way that it views the world itself as this revolutionary movement. The alternative is for the ANC to become more like a kind of more mainstream left-wing party in more established democracies. I'm thinking something like the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, where it's still very much left of center, but it gives up this idea that it is this sort of sacred revolutionary force who is destined to control all of society. And that means abandoning things like cadre deployment, for example. The ANC doesn't seem able to choose between these two. In the end, circumstances are going to force them to choose, because they're going to have to make a deal with someone, and that will set in motion things. I don't know. Michael, what do you make of all this? In some ways, I see this, if I've maybe had something to, to soothe the nerves, and I'm feeling very optimistic and fluffy, I can kind of see how this might sort of kind of work. But on the other hand, it seems like there's a lot of space between the DA and the ANC at this point in negotiations on coalition. What do you make of this?
I mean, very interesting all round, and I think exciting at the very least. I'm an optimist by nature, so I do tend to feel optimistic by anything that is capable of changing and capable of being dynamic, and I think this is what we're seeing. But there's no question that we are facing huge risks. I liked Terence's idea of the macro picture, dealing with the macro picture first. And I think the one thing we're seeing is a kind of receding of foregone conclusions. And fixed ideological positions are not going to deliver what any of the parties I think are really might pin their hopes on. There's a sense that there's got to be a big dose of pragmatism here, some compromise, and so on. I think it's exciting. I think the mold of South African politics is at least cracked. I'm not sure if it's necessarily broken, but as both you and Terence have emphasised, this does mean that there are enormous risks. Things could go very badly wrong. We're talking about two organizations, two strands of sort of political tradition in South Africa that are kind of daggers drawn for a very long time, and I think on both sides there's possibly, well, both sides certainly there's a challenge, a requirement to be politically smart, and that can be difficult when you are always having to worry about supporters, where your supporters are. Are you taking your people with you? I remember covering the big change in end of the 1980s, and you had the sense that F.W. de Klerk was astute enough to take his people with him, and he did it very cleverly in 1992. And when I say his people, I mean the mainstream South African society, or the empowered South African society, the enfranchised society. When he called that referendum, that in fact expanded his in a very abstract way, but also in a very real way, expanded his support base way beyond the National Party to include all of white people who were in favor of reform. So it was a very clever move on his part, but all the time he had the sense that he needed to have his people with him. And I think that was also a challenge for the ANC to make sure that the exiles and the inciles were sort of on the same page. And Mandela, who'd been talking privately to Kobus Coetzee, that was also somehow legitimate, and so on. So this question of negotiating and making changes and so on, I understand that one must appreciate the parties in a very, very tender position of constantly being having to be aware of where their people are. If you lose your people, you aren't a negotiator anymore. So smart politics required. I think the DA proposals suggest a seriousness of purpose. That's quite an important thing, I think, to say, and I think there's probably very considerable public support for a slightly less oppositional politics and a more pragmatic approach that's actually going to produce results. I think the country is in that space. Most people actually are now, they're not really going to be too fussed if their certain principles are compromised a little bit. That's just how it is. We in the liberal think tank, we very focused on, you're either this or you're that. Although I think we do also, Terence, I hope I'm right in saying we do also appreciate trade-offs and pragmatism. But obviously, the reason we believe in our principles is because they are fundamental to doing things, not necessarily to the outcome, but the way you do the thing delivers either a free, growing society or a society that is mired in failure and immiseration. So the principles are important, but we've also now got this opportunity to make some advances. I think the idea of exploiting a wider talent pool, in the case particularly of finance ministers, that suggests to me quite a serious-minded approach to negotiations. I don't know whose idea that was, which side, but that would strike me as a good direction to go in. Instead of having a huge row over which party is going to get the finance minister, how about agreeing on an outside neutral, more or less neutral, nobody's really neutral, but an outside technocratic and meritoriously acknowledged individual to take on this critical role. So that's quite an interesting development for me. It seems to suggest that this is slightly more serious than simply horse trading over who's going to get what. That there is maybe a sense that we've reached a point where we really do need to look at those national interests. I know I agree with Terence that the good of the country depends on what your perspective is, and I think Terence is quite right to warn about that sentimentalism, which we're very fond of. I think as South Africans, I think we're very prone to being sentimental about all the good things, and build South Africa, new dawns, and we can do this together. Let's work as a team. Well, that's all fine and good, but there's got to be a fairly good understanding of what we're agreeing on and so on. So yeah, overall, I think very risky, but exciting. I think breaking the mold, that's a good thing. We need to be doing that. I think tighten seatbelts and get the get your store of popcorn built up. It's going to be very interesting.
Yes, no, it's. Go ahead, Terence.
Look, if I may, I think that there is a huge opportunity here, which I think the sort of piece of the brave, if you like, and it'd be this: for the DA to say, okay, they are willing to stake their reputation on supporting the party that they have opposed, I think fiercely, and I think in many respects quite rightly, for 30 years, and for those in the ANC who actually do take things like constitutionalism, the rule of law, and let's say the national interest as distinct from the party interest, which in many ways has simply has become a very, very thin and threadbare veneer for criminality. To say, okay, well, we will try and create some sort of new center, and that means that for the ANC, chopping or for that faction of the ANC, chopping off the SACP, the COSATU types, the various tenderpreneur entrepreneurship and effectively criminal elements of their structure, and saying, well, maybe our future is to be a 30% party. Maybe it is to be a sort of left of center party that represents aspirant lower middle class people and a certain historic legacy class out in the sticks, and then trying to modernize ourselves. But to say that we actually do rather like the Constitution, and this idea that it's just an interim phase as we wait the glorious uplands of socialism. And, as COSATU once memorably said, replacing all bourgeois institutions with workers' institutions, that's actually not where we are. Does that sort of vision exist? I'm not sure. It hasn't existed in the past 30 years, even with people like Nelson Mandela, who I think for good reason was very much loved.
Yes, no, definitely. That there has to be a mind shift there. But the one thing that this, regardless of how well this coalition works or whether it comes together or any of those questions, the one question that is definitely not going to be answered in South African politics about this one is the role of racial policy. And that, of course, I'm referring to things like Black economic empowerment, preferential procurement, stuff like that, which are policies, of course, that the DA opposes. And have been a major fault line inside that party, and which the ANC is completely married to now. Us at the IRR, we have written a lot criticizing exactly how BEE as a policy has caused enormous problems for the country, that it has not achieved its aim of uplifting poor Black South Africans and instead has just created a connected, wealthy elite. How it's kind of gone hand in hand. It's it's been used as a shield to allow kind of catered deployment in some places. How it's created all sorts of problems in the civil service, and that is one position which it seems the DA and the ANC will never agree on. And so I think that's going to be a very bitter pill in some ways just for the DA to swallow, is that considering how big of a role that has played in damaging our economy and our society, and race relations, to be honest, the DA is just going to have to sort of sit there and swallow that pill, because the ANC will never, it seems, abandon that. Or I don't know. Do you think they will, Michael? What are your thoughts on that issue?
I often think the cleverest people in the world, I always used to say as a journalist, are newspaper readers. And I think the cleverest people in the world are just a kind of ordinary man on the street. If you look at our polling on the question of what is going to make South Africa a better place, it's the very, very high percentages. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the very high percentages over many years have suggested that most people think that if all communities are given opportunities in the country, that education is improved, that our economy is growing, that we will get on better and the country will succeed. So our success as a country, in the minds of most South Africans, appears to be that if we do overcome these imposed divisions, then we're on the right track. So I think there's potentially an opportunity for a combined government or government that combines these opposites as you've described them. For the one side to gradually convince the other that look, we don't actually need to have these racial strictures in place. What we need to have is economic growth. You will see people beginning to get out of the lower middle class or working class categories or straighter and sort of move up into society, live better lives. The other thing that's always interesting, I know that our former CEO, France Premier, always underlined this point, that where the economics of the country, where the literally household well-being was improving, that the ANC's performance improved as well. So there does seem to be a relationship, at least if not necessarily a causal one, between the well-being of households and political performance. And I think that might be the thing that liberals in a kind of cooperative government could constantly emphasize, is that you don't actually need to have these archaic regulations and laws that are fundamentally based on apartheid thinking, on the Population Registration Act of 1950, that you define people by what they look like, that we can actually dispense with that and deliver a society that is benefiting more and more people because it's growing, because it's free. So yeah, I think there's a potential here to overcome that resistance, but I don't think it'll be easy. I think you're right.
Yes, if the ANC, as part of its sort of stated goal, is to de-racialize the economy, it's the argument that we need to keep making here at the IRR, but also that I think all opponents of policies like BE need to make, is that BE hasn't worked. If you want to de-racialize the economy, the ANC has been pursuing it aggressively for 24 years at least now, and it has not actually changed the fundamental structure. Lots of people continue to live in poverty. Society hasn't had major improvement in its well-being for at least 10 years now, and that is why it's time that you maybe look a little bit outside the box, and instead of saying we need BE to fix racial inequality, no, you don't. No, you don't. And what do I have as evidence for that? The fact that we've tried it so much and it hasn't done the job. Terence, any final thoughts for today?
Yeah, look, I think that okay, I think this gets to what the sort of cooperation could, in an ideal world, produce. Now, and I think that you mentioned thinking outside the box, very important. I think we've got to perhaps dispense with this idea that this is all going to be about a sort of 5-year marriage, where we'll cooperate and blah blah blah. I don't think that's true. But as I've said, if you we are facing a crisis, and I think that part of forming, let's say, a coalition to deal with it, as distinct from the sort of coalition to elect the president in 14 days, is going to require building trust. Now, on the BE thing, that's simply not in the ANC's radar. And I think quite wisely the DA hasn't put this down as a condition, because I think that would destroy any prospect of even having the discussion. But perhaps what we can do is say, well, the choice, what is immediately possible, is do we go into a rapid Zimbabwe-style descent, or do we carry on with the slow collapse that we're experiencing now? Well, option 2 is probably better. Maybe in 6 months' time, after some trust has been built, the DA and the ANC can have a conversation about, well, what can we do to improve Operation Vulindlela, which they both are technically in favor of. And maybe 6 months down the line from there, they can talk about immigration reform or something on the periphery. And maybe then, 2 years down the line, there is enough, sense of common purpose, that something like affirmative action or BE or whatever can start to come onto the agenda. Because I think ultimately to turn the ship around, and this is, it can either be done, because there's a massive voter rebellion against it, which we haven't seen, or by changing some of the opinions of political leaders, which has not yet occurred. But perhaps this offers an opportunity where that process could start. Now, this is long term. It's unsure, but I do think that we are in a sense a very different country from what we were in 30 days ago. And who knows
Yes.
what the country could look like in 30 months.
Yeah, I think
Better or
it's
worse.
probably fair to say that we're not really, the next 5 years are not going to solve a lot of our problems in South Africa.
No.
But it's going to be the beginning of the shaping of what solutions we're going to try. And some of those solutions might be terrible ideas. For example, if we decide to charge forward with expropriation without compensation, as the ANC has been doing up until this election, we will, and then that becomes entrenched after 2029, we will end up in a country that is much poorer and worse off for everyone. Likewise, if we decide to actually start engaging in some positive reforms, as you mentioned, some of those areas of possible cooperation, Terence, we may begin to see some direction of improvement, and after 2029, maybe we can actually start implementing those solutions with a more coherent government.
That's the point. I see one of our viewers has said maybe get them to cancel NHI. Now, what I'm suggesting is that that's not a discussion you can even have right now. But maybe they could say, well, let's put NHI aside. Let's say, what can we do to improve the performance of public hospitals? What can let's understand drivers of high healthcare costs, and then we can put issues like, well, if you're going to demand a 30% B premium on everything that you buy for your health service, that means a lot less healthcare for your people. Now, you choose.
Yeah.
This is long-term stuff.
Exactly. All right. So yeah, it continues to be an exciting time, and we still don't know exactly what's going to happen. I believe they have something like 6 days left before Parliament has to meet to negotiate this. I think the 16th of June. I may be wrong on that. Is the date by which they have to finalize, which is very close. So in 6 days, who knows? Maybe we'll have the same president. Maybe we'll have a different one. Maybe we'll have the same government. Maybe we'll have a completely weird and wacky one. There's a lot that's still uncertain here, but interesting to keep an eye on going forward. Anyway, we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and cheers, everyone.